Amendment to be agreed to, and I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, the great tragedy of the carbon tax debate will be that school children a generation from now will learn not about the respective strategies of either sides of these chambers. What they will learn about was the ham-fisted mishandling by the Labor Party from 2007 to 2013 of the carbon and abatement reduction issue. And what we have seen is constant flux and change from a party confused between the moral challenge of this generation and the practical reality of Australian families who are struggling with ever-increasing cost of living. Deputy Speaker, we are almost alone globally as a nation that has effectively put huge amounts of political capital into this carbon tax debate. And it's a debate with such ferocious intensity that visitors to these shores are somewhat surprised as to how we got here. And it's worth looking back to 2007 and aspiring Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who attempted to make the carbon tax and emission reduction an issue upon which he would set himself apart, while at the same time attempting to be as similar to John Howard as he possibly could on virtually every other issue. And in 2007, of course, there was hope of some international agreement. And it's disappointing that the member for Canberra devoted half of his speech to reading out quotes from coalition MPs from 2007, because politically it was a very different time, where indeed there was hope of some form of international agreement. There was hope that we could go to Copenhagen and strike an agreement, and there were MPs from both sides of this chamber who were willing to give that very prospect a chance. What we have is a Labor Party that failed to come to grips with that reality. And when it fell apart at Copenhagen, and we had then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd with the shiny apple of his own ETS in the front row of international agreements, completely ignored by the major economies of the world, he came back, walked back over his moral minefield and backed out of the space completely. And with that lack of confidence that was transmitted to the Australian people, he was soon replaced as leader, probably for that reason more than any other. Enter the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, making whatever promise it took to win the 2010 election. And by this time, the low levels of scepticism, which in my electorate were around 13 to 16%, had grown to nearly 40%, primarily because such an important policy issue became a political football exploited by the other side of this chamber. We are in a more paralysed, more confused and more polarised position than any other country on the planet because of the handling of this former government. And of course, when Wayne Swan said it was a hysterical allegation, when the previous Prime Minister Julia Gillard said that under no government she led would there be a carbon tax, Australians gave them one more chance, only to see it betrayed within weeks. And let me make it very clear, there was no need to embark on a carbon tax in order to gain a Greens agreement to govern. This was a Prime Minister that should have said, I need your support to govern, but you know what? I made a commitment to the Australian people and it's something that I cannot break. Because what she said was quite simple. There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead, and it should have been watertight, but it wasn't. And it was at that moment she wrote the political epitaph for her administration. At that moment. And she never recovered. So I'm giving this political context to say, haven't times changed? Because in my very marginal seat, where there was 16% scepticism towards carbon tax and emission trading, that soon tripled. And we now have a situation where even reasoned debate from members of this chamber will probably fail to convince nearly half of our population that this vitally important issue is something that our great economy can move forward on. Now, let's not forget that both sides of this chamber have agreed to 5% reductions on 2000 levels. Now, that's an impressive cut, and it may not be enough, but we have still been hectored by the Labor Party for not reducing emissions satisfactorily. And yet their own figures show that under their carbon tax, Australia's emissions will increase from 560 gigatonnes to 637 gigatonnes. That's not a reduction. That's an increase. And constantly, and from the perfectly coiffured member for Kingsford Smith, we've had an elaborate argument about the lack of market mechanism in direct action. Well, let's just step back and have a look at international efforts around the world. Last time I checked, the UN clean energy abatement process involved abatement procurement. That must be then a market mechanism. So is Norway's attempts to purchase abatement, as are Japan's. In fact, anything that is not direct action, which is purposely and specifically purchasing abatements, is by definition indirect action. And the whole problem is that we are incorporating in this purist and economic approach to involving everyone in carbon abatement, we are affecting, we are molesting, we are ripping into a system where people who cannot do anything to reduce their emissions pay anyway. If you are a senior living in my electorate, huddled around the heater in winter, made to pay more for your energy, wrapping a blanket around you because you can't afford to turn on a heater, I don't want a bureaucrat telling me $550 should be enough. I'd rather you didn't take the money in the first place. That's why half of Australia doesn't want this bloody tax. It's quite simple, Deputy Speaker. And if you involve people who can make no difference to emission reduction in this intentionally labyrinthine process, then you will get this kickback. Let me go back a step. If you want to abate some emissions and you intentionally tender that process, surely that's a market mechanism. I mean, if I put $1 on the table and ask all comers to deliver a service or a good for me for that price, surely that's a market mechanism. If I have a price at a service station for fuel and people can drive in and pay for the fuel, it's a market mechanism. $3.8 billion of all of Labor's approaches towards emission reduction was direct action. Every time you gave money to a brown coal burning power station to clean it up, as this Labor Party did, Deputy Speaker, it was direct action. I mean, everything the globe has ever done to reduce emissions that didn't involve an economy-wide tax was by definition direct action. So Norway can do it, Japan can do it, the UN can do it, but any direct action that's here in Australia is just somehow anathema. I mean, seriously, we have an emissions target. You can purchase abatement directly, or you can have an economy-wide tax. To my second point, and emphasised strongly by the member for Canberra, yes, most economists prefer an economy-wide scheme. That's because they're economists. And if economists had their way, Deputy Speaker, we'd have a market-based mechanism for everything, for returning plastic containers, aluminium cans, ring pulls, the lot. You could have an economy-wide scheme for all of them. But there are too many unforeseen costs, the returns are not sufficient, there's too much deadweight loss, so we don't do it. That's Economics 102. Of course, not every economic idea becomes reality because there are practical implications, and that is that most people, through their ordinary work and going about their ordinary endeavours, have very little latitude, very little ability to change their basic emissions. We can't rebuild our houses. After you've insulated the ceilings, there's not much more you can do. So why do we make everyone pay more and then write them a cheque and assume that's going to cover everyone, regardless of your fuel stress, the distance you live from a CBD or where you work, the number of people who live in your household, the materials which you have built your dwelling, all change those figures and make it horribly imprecise. So, Deputy Speaker, times have changed. This is a Labor Party that has traduced this debate. The politics of it has been appallingly handled, and it's made it very hard for moderate members in this place to forge a way ahead. It has become polarised, it's become difficult, and now we have a government that specialises in collecting money, specialises in collecting revenue even before it's received, and specialises in spending it before they've even seen it, now lecturing us about a direct and targeted approach to reducing emissions. There is a role for technology. There is a role for our major agricultural and commodity economies with whom we both trade and compete to come to an agreement at some time in the future. In 2008, it looked like it could happen, and Australia went there with good faith. There is no prospect of that anymore. No prospect in the US, despite their $3 a tonne tax on their 9 eastern seaboard states. $3 a tonne. Okay? Nothing in Canada. I don't see anything happening in Russia. I don't see Japan doing anything. I don't see China doing anything until 2020. So call me in 2019, because I think my phone will be fairly quiet 2 elections from now, let's have a look at what China's doing, and then maybe we can reinstigate international dialogue about a global approach and an approach with our trading partners. I mean, it's not just about big economies, it's about economies that have the same endowments as ours. I don't want to see effort shift with major mining enterprises moving to places where there's not a carbon tax. This government had no answer to that double blow of a carbon and a mining tax. This side of politics will not stand by and watch high-paying jobs go to Zambia. No way. And we will go to international mining conferences and see auditoriums packed with new starts in the African continent, new starts in South America, new starts in Siberia, and the room where it's talking about starting an enterprise in Australia that gives jobs to my friends and my friends' children simply not occurring. That is the legacy that will be studied a generation from now. There is a chance still for the globe if we get together, there's no doubt. There is still a chance for major economies to take the lead, but there was no point embarking on a $30+ carbon tax in the absence of having other shoulders to the wheel, in the absence of having other economies move with us in a realistic way. I know in your hands you can count a dozen or so countries that have embarked on a carbon tax. But, Deputy Speaker, they are Swiss cheese carbon taxes. They are carbon taxes with all the exemptions where it might in any way affect their most beloved sectors. And I respect those countries for doing it, but paying $1 through to $11 per tonne is something very different to what was being foisted on us by a government that paid so heavily for such political short-sightedness. It was a government for 6 years, Deputy Speaker, as I said, spent the money before they collected it, and nibbling away, no, eroding confidence in them was the simple fact that the money, hard-working money earned by you and me, was collected by a government, potentially $16 billion before there was any emission reduction at all, and then frittered away in everything from insulating ceilings to green loan schemes where young Australians invested $3,000 of their own money to become a green loan assessor and do their part to reduce emissions in this great nation. And what happened? It was ripped away from under them with no compensation. Close friends of mine trusted a government, just trusted a government that would not possibly destroy an ambition or a dream to help in this great green crusade that many of us had bought into. No, they lost everything. And from an environment minister who chopped the numbers, who cancelled the program by SMS and left them with no recompense and no refund for money they spent on training, registration, thousands of dollars gone, up in smoke. Similarly, the Pink Bat scheme, again, just examples of where this money was going to be spent. The Clean Energy Fund, similarly, simply propping up what are non-viable loans potentially in the private banking sector. And people lost confidence. What they are looking for, in conclusion, is a government that does what it says one thing before election and delivers it afterwards. It's a coalition government utterly committed to that. And don't for one moment think that the emission abatement cannot be equivalent to what was proposed over on this side of the House. But I've got a very, very simple message to the people in my electorate of Bowman and outer metropolitan, Bayside economy, deeply concerned about the ecology, deeply concerned about the environment, and very proud of the environmental protection we've achieved so far. You travel from Islands to Brisbane, and under the Labor Party you'll pay a carbon tax on all of your transport every day, backwards and forwards. That's right, every day. What do you do about that under the Labor government scheme? Swim? Sail? A pedal boat? I mean, seriously, there is no way to reduce those emissions other than get on that boat and pay more through the removal of a diesel rebate under the Labor government's carbon tax. We go to the dumps every weekend and hope that we can not have the carbon tax on our major landfill, and we do. How can we possibly make major reductions in the waste that we leave in our bins and have collected or have dropped on weekends? It's extremely hard to do, and simply an economy-wide tax on everything we did hurt too many people at a time when the economy was too precariously balanced and at a time where international confidence to move forward is limited. We must move with direct action. We must be focused, we must gain those reductions, and we can do it without the punishment of an economy-wide carbon tax.